Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family. Talk about adoption and foster care. Today, we're going to be talking about how transracial adoptees navigate race as they age. I have been looking forward to this interview all day. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Here's a sample of what you're going to hear.
I think a lot of transracial adoptees, it's a lot easier for us to go to the place of questioning, and then other people do question us. And so I think it's a harder task of developing an identity that's grounded in relationships and one's lived experience. And I think that then becomes the task of the parent to figure out how do I do that so that my child's identity isn't just a label or learning to like kimchi. Being Korean is more than eating kimchi. Being Korean is more than saying you're Korean or looking like you're Korean.
Hey, guys, if you are listening to us, and I have a personal huge favor to ask. Actually, it's not that huge. I have a favor to ask. I need you to pop over to iTunes and give us a rating. We read every single one. In fact, we often share them amongst our team here at Creating a Family. They mean a lot to us, and they help us know what we're doing and doing right and doing wrong. But most important, they help iTunes help people find us. So it really does help us, and you guys are the only ones who could do it, so please do. This show is brought to you by Creating a Family. We are the National Adoption and Foster Care Education and Support nonprofit. I'm Dawn Davenport. I'm your host, and I'm the director of Creating a Family. And you can find us and everything we do at creatingafamily.org. This show is underwritten by the Jockey Being Family Foundation. Their mission is to strengthen adoptive families through post-adoption services. And one way they do it is through their free backpack program, which they offer to agencies for no charge. And they provide a newly adopted child with their own backpack, which is customized with their initial and cute little blanket and a bear. But most important, or at least from my perspective most important, are the parenting resources that are provided in the backpack for the parents. So if you are a newly adopted family, or if you know one, please ask your agency to join the Jockey Being Family Backpack Program, and they can get more information about it at their website, which is jockeybeingfamily.com. And let me also remind you that in addition to our underwriter, our partners also support what we do at Creating a Family. And they are organizations and agencies that believe in education, both pre- and post-adoption and fostering education. They believe in our mission, and they believe in it enough to support us financially. And that is how we exist. One such partner is Holt International. They were founded in 1956. And they want every child to have a loving and secure home. And they have programs that strengthen and preserve families that are at risk of separation. And they lead the global community in finding families for children who need them. And you can get more information at their website. Today we're going to be talking about how transracial adoptees navigate race as they age. Our guest is Dr. Gina Samuels. She is an associate professor with the University of Chicago at their School of Social Services Administration. She is also an affiliate with the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and she is a transracial adoptee. I am so looking forward, Dr. Samuels, to talking with you about this topic. It's an important one, and actually it's one I think about a whole lot, so it's one that is, believe it or not, fun for me to talk about. So anyway, welcome,
Great.
Dr. Samuels.
Thank you.
And I'm looking forward to this interview. And let me just say at the outset that we are talking about all types of transracial adoption. We tend to think of white parents adopting brown or black kids. However, we're also talking about, and we're thinking of African-American children or Hispanic kids, but that would also include most international adoptions are transracial. And I think that's important to know. And we are hearing more and more now, I think because we're one of the few people who has resources on this, but black families adopting white kids. So that also is, and there's some differences there. But anyway, I just want for parents to be thinking outside of the literal and figurative black and white box. Okay. Let's start by talking about how non-adoptees kids who are being raised in a family of their same race. How do they develop? How do children develop an awareness of race?
So now we used to think that kids didn't develop an awareness of race until much older, and now we're knowing that kids actually, and even babies, can distinguish differences that we would ascribe to racial features like skin tone or hair texture or nose or mouth, things that as adults we racialize. Even infants can make these distinctions in characteristics of different faces, and so that becomes the sort of literal visual awareness of race. But as we grow up in our families, we tend to pick up cues in terms of who our parents are, who they rush to talk to, who they don't rush to talk to, who's in our home, and this starts to scaffold our growing and emerging awareness of race as a thing, race as a characteristic around which we describe people, and with a whole language around which we then label. Any parent who has done drawing exercises with a child will know that they start to try to color different shades, and at some ages people are green and orange and blue, and then at various points along their development, kids start to become more specific and and use the race matching in the color box. I remember my nephew once looking through. I'm biracial, and so my nephew was looking through the color box, and he sadly looks up at me and says, "Auntie Gina, there's no color for you." And he was about 4 when he did this. So. And he was not.
And truthfully, there might not have been a color for you. So.
And there wasn't. I know.
Yeah.
The world is not kind to us as biracial people. But so I think all children, regardless of whether or not they're adopted, are slowly starting to pick up the cues in terms of how we organize ourselves in terms of race.
And I think people need to realize that we're talking preschool when we're talking about
right.
the age. And as opposed to, and you point out even infants, there have been some fascinating studies on infants, but certainly by preschool. So how old, and I know you do research in this area as well and also keep up with the research. So how old are kids, transracially adopted kids, when they realize that they are a different race than their parents?
Well, sometimes it can be immediately because it's brought to their attention. So, there are some adoptees that I talk to who will tell stories about remembering being 3 or 4 when people might have approached them in a store to ask them various questions that signal that there's a difference. And then when that happens, that introduces the idea and topic of race, even sometimes before a child might be necessarily paying attention to it. But I think it's always important to remember that while a child might be aware of difference, they don't necessarily always assign all of the weight and meaning that we adults have now come to learn come with these differences or are supposed to come with these differences. But kids, as early as they can start to process language and understand why somebody's staring or why somebody's coming up and asking them their parent questions or them questions, start to become aware of race, which is, I think, some of the ways in which the context of race awareness is a little different, because you do have a family that's very conspicuous, and so because of that obviousness, sometimes the world brings race to you a little earlier than it might to other families where everyone seems to match by race.
And you use the term a conspicuous family, and no doubt transracial families stand out. And in a way, because it is our kids, especially if our children come to us very young, it is their norm. So for them, being
right,
if they're not sometimes even aware that our families stand out, because it's always stood out. As parents, we notice it, but our children don't. But at some point, our kids do notice it. And as you point out, it may be saying something, but it could also just be noticing that people are looking at them and not looking at them as a family and not looking at other families. Does racial awareness and identity differ then for a child being raised by a family of a different race? You said one thing, that it tends to have their awareness of their self as different from their parents. is one aspect of race, and that does, your thinking probably happens fairly young.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other racial awareness and identity differences that a kid who is raised by, let's say, an African American kid being raised by white parents, or an Asian child being raised by white?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what we oftentimes undervalue about the racial identity development process is how relational it is. That when we develop an identity, it's not just a label. You know, our sense of ourselves as girls or women, our sense of ourselves as gay or straight or whatever the master identities that matter in our society are. These aren't just sort of innocuous, meaningless labels, but they come with a bunch of assumptions about the relationships we've had, the families that we've grown up in, the people we know, the kinds of food we eat, the languages we're inclined to speak, the things we think are funny, the movies we've watched, etc. And I think what is profoundly different for transracial adoptees is that oftentimes our growing up, all we have is this label of what we are and the physical evidence of our connection to a group of people who we are not currently living with. And so it leaves you a little ungrounded in developing a sense of confidence that comes when you grow up having a label that is also lodged within relationships with people who also have this label and this lived experience and this history. And it sometimes can make transracial adoptees feel uncertain about what really does it mean to be Korean. If I've never been to Korea in my own awareness, I don't live with people in my house who are Korean. I don't go to school with a whole bunch of people. Yeah. And I don't like kimchi. So what does this mean? I don't speak Korean. And Koreans look at me and say, I'm not Korean. So what do I do with this?
So what am I?
You know, what am I? And so a child, that same child who doesn't like kimchi, who's never been to Korea, who doesn't speak Korean, but is growing up being raised by two Korean parents who are Korean and may or may not like kimchi, but have been to Korea and have this history, you don't necessarily so automatically question your Koreanness. But I think a lot of transracial adoptees, it's a lot easier for us to go to the place of questioning, and then other people do question us. And so I think it's a harder task of developing an identity that's grounded in relationships and one's lived experience. And I think that then becomes the task of the parent to figure out how do I do that so that my child's identity isn't just a label or learning to like kimchi. Being Korean is more than eating kimchi. Being Korean is more than saying you're Korean or looking like you're Korean.
And I think we've been talking earlier, we were talking ages, and I think it's important to note that oftentimes we hear parents say, you know, my child doesn't really identify at all or even think of herself as being black, or actually they probably wouldn't say that now because that would be considered inappropriate, but they might still say it about Chinese or Korean. And but oftentimes this awareness of this differentness doesn't come until the child leaves home, and it may be the first time. It could be summer camp. It could be, but it often is at college because all of a sudden people are meeting you and they're making assumptions that you're black, so your parents are black, and you're going to know a lot about and identify with the black culture, or you're Korean, and I think that we hear a lot from adult adoptees, or this case, young adult adoptees, that's when, and it doesn't have to be a crisis, but it does have to be a coming awareness of how am I going to, who do I identify, who am I? So that's another time of racial identity. Has that been shown to be a particularly, I shouldn't say troublesome necessarily, because I don't want to be putting a label on it, but is that the time when late adolescence, when children are leaving the umbrella of their family, is that a time of a racial awakening and identity awakening?
Yeah, I think it could be. So to your point of not wanting to label it troublesome, I would just say it's a really active moment in
Yes.
development. I think
Mhm.
for anyone, this transition to adulthood moment is really an active time of figuring out, how are you going to make your own decisions? What schools are you going to go to? And a
Mhm.
lot of times for transracial adoptees, these experiences also have overlain on top of them developmental opportunities that sometimes were delayed. And so, to the parent who says, "Oh, my kid just isn't really interested in that." Well, if since the day you adopted them, you have not been exposing them on going to it as just an everyday feature of their growing up, they don't have that to choose from. So it sort of suggests that an interest should be natural, and it's not. These are things that you develop in a child, just like you would develop religion or you would develop a piano skill or something else that you're wanting to develop in your child or a second language. And so when that hasn't happened, a lot of transracial adoptees who do go to college, there are many people who don't go to college, but for people who do go to college, that becomes a developmental context to sometimes for the first time try on identities that weren't readily available and try on relationships. And that goes back to my point about identity being relational, that you just really have to have more than just a label or a heritage in order to make sense and operate from the place of having an identity or feeling a sense of belonging. And so a lot of adoptees will go to college and they will find there's all kinds of clubs on my campus. You can be in a club for pretty much everything. There are sororities. Many of these sororities and fraternities are highly racially segregated. And so many young adults use this as an opportunity in a moment to explore. And all people do that in college, but for transracial adoptees, it is often overlaid with a lot of racial identity searching, sometimes sexuality, identity searching, all these identities that tend to get oppressed in our own family systems when they are not prepared to nurture those identities. When we get outside of our family systems, that gives it an opportunity to be explored outside of a family where that may not have been an option for a young person.
Do you think that racial identity and awareness differ if you are of the majority race or the minority race where you live?
Could you say a little bit more about what you're wanting me to speak about on that one?
We sometimes hear from parents, white parents, who say, I don't really, racial identity, I don't identify as being white. I identify as being human or whatever. And it makes me wonder if that, and if they then want to apply that to their child, let's say they have a child, and they want to say, I don't want my child being raised making assumptions about themselves because of their race. I want them to identify with whatever, the human race or whatever. That tends to be a cliche. And I just wonder if there's a difference between if it's a white parent saying it and they live in the U.S., which is majority white, how that influences their ability to say that.
Yeah. Oh, I think it has everything to do with that. I mean, I think that's core to white privilege. So part of being white and being the majority dominant racial group is that you don't have to think about your race. That this society as it now exists in the US is orchestrated around whiteness. And so you don't have to think about figures of positive representation for yourself because it's everywhere on TV, on birthday cards, in movies, in cartoons, in research. Everywhere there are places of representation of whiteness that are both complex, good and bad, but in particular send messages about all the things that white people can do and be. And so you don't have to think about that as an identity to protect or to nurture because society has done that because we're in a white dominated society. And so part of white privilege is that freedom to not have to think about all the ways in which race in terms of whiteness matters for you. But there's a whole group of other people who are not white who don't have that race privilege to not think about it. And so it's an logical error for a white person or a parent to think that they can confer that white privilege onto their child just because it's their child. Race doesn't work that way, and privilege doesn't work that way. And while they may benefit a little bit from having a parent that has some race privilege, they will move through the world with a different skin and a different appearance, and therefore a different experience of race, and race will matter for them. And so I think, parents I'd like to believe that's a well-intended kind of thing, but that's just an impossibility, and it's actually a harmful thing to do to a child who will not ever be given that kind of privilege in society.
Because you're not preparing them for the reality.
Right, for their reality. Right, you're preparing them for your reality, which is real, but it's not their reality.
But it's not theirs.
So, it's just not theirs.
And when they're 5, it may be a little bit theirs.
Yep,
but they won't be aware. But when they're 12,
it's not going to be anymore.
Yeah, exactly. There are we hear from people who say whites who say, I hear about this white privilege, but I don't feel privileged.
I don't feel privileged.
I worked my butt off. I had to put myself through school, and nobody gave me a darn thing. So talk to them about that.
So I think people who kind of are resistant to that are misunderstanding what white privilege really means. White privilege doesn't mean that you haven't suffered, or that you haven't worked hard, or that all of your life has been easy, or that that you can have white privilege and then be a woman and experience sexism. You can have white privilege and be gay and experience homophobia. You can be white and disabled and experience incredible disadvantage because of your disability, or be white and poor. But that doesn't undo the white part of it. So these ideas that we have privilege and that somehow it's all-consuming, the fact that I am a cisgendered female who's heterosexual, these are privileges, but I also am black, I'm biracial, I have these other experiences. And so being privileged doesn't mean that your life is easy, or that you haven't earned things, or that you haven't worked hard, but it does mean that you exist as a white person in a system that is set up for white people to succeed, and that the same kind of hard work in a different body may not have been allowed to reap the benefits of their hard work in the same way. That there have been policies, systematic policies, and practices that work in favor of rewarding white people or white-appearing people for the hard work that they do, and not rewarding or even sometimes punishing and limiting, actively constraining people who are brown for the same hard work and sometimes harder work that they do. And so that's what white privilege, I think people get caught up in, but I, suffered this loss. And no, white privilege doesn't mean your life has been great. It just means that you have a characteristic that in our society is valued and protected and held up as the norm. It means that you can say you're just a person, and that you're just normal, and that you're just average. And then what does that mean about everybody else? Yeah, that I'm a member of the human race. Or that when somebody says American, they think of a white person. Or when they say, just people, they mean white. And so it's that you are the default, you are the norm, and there's all these other people who are not. And that's what white privilege means.
So what should adoptive parents do? We, assuming I'm speaking at this point of the white adoptive parent who is parenting children of color. So we walk in the world in our white skin, and we have privileges whether we recognize them or not.
Right.
We have privileges because of that our children aren't going to have. We may hope that the world is different by the time they're adults, but chances are good it's not going to be that different. So what should we as adoptive parents do? We can't give them our privilege, so how do we prepare them to walk through the world without this privilege?
Yeah, well, I think the first step is what we were talking about earlier, is just recognizing that there are different experiences in the world than yours, and that as a white person, your experience, even for your own child, may not always be the best starting place to understand what your kid needs. That doesn't mean that anything you know is not worthwhile, or that there's nothing that you can impart, or that would be ridiculous to say. but it does mean that you may need some other reference points, and that it would be ideal if you had some of these reference points prior to adopting, so that you're not learning kind of at the expense of your kid as your kid is going through things that you may have never anticipated them going through. I think it requires being really open and humble, and not when your child comes to you from a place of pain that something has happened that is the thing that you were worried about with regard to race, that you thought you could wait another year or wait until they, whatever the wait moment is, but it happened earlier, that you don't ask them to prove it to you or to justify that it really was racism, and that you meet them at the place that they're experiencing this and be their advocate and their ally, even if it's something that you see differently, and even if it's something that you wished was different or that you never experienced before. And I think just being open to that these things change. Part of the conversation today is about thinking about, adoption as a lifelong context for development, and the things that they need, and the ways and the importance of race at 5 and will be different than at 10, will be different at 20, 50, that these things ebb and flow over development, and that it will require continued growth. The way you respond to race stuff to a 5-year-old is a very different way than you'll need to respond to it when they're 12 and 15. And if your development of racial sophistication is at the 5-year-old level, then it just signals you got some learning catch-up that you have to do. And so to develop some allies of your own and some supports of your own, so that you can find ways of figuring out how do you want to talk with your child about these experiences.
You talked about reference points, that parents need reference points. What do you mean? Or give me some examples of what you mean by reference points that parents should have ideally in place before, but if not before,
yeah.
Today is a good time to begin.
Yeah, today is a good time. Today is never too late. So, I think the quick, obvious places are things like books and training videos and groups, that are designed to be spaces where parents can get caught up on just kind of basic information. And I would say that's that's kind of the no-brainer, easy thing. It's a low commitment. It's just as easy to do. I think the more lasting and important points of reference would be developing relationships with people. And ideally, you will have had these things before you decided to adopt, so that you're not going out fishing for friendships because you are now adopting a kid of a particular race, and this is going to be the first time that you've had a relationship with a person of that particular race. But even if that's the case, to start building your community so that as these things happen, you're not left kind of holding the bag with your child for a response and not exactly knowing how to make meaning about this. Is it a big deal? Is it not a big deal? Should you go in and talk to the school? Should you not go in and talk at the school? And just having a sounding board. There's all kinds of parent boards, even for people who aren't transracially adopting, of, kind of thinking through different dilemmas of parenting that are just kind of common to any parents. And there are those certainly for transracial adoptive parents. But I think transracial adoptive parents need both older cohorts of transracial adoptive parents who can forewarn them for what's down the line, so like a peer mentoring, but also they need people who aren't part of the transracial adoptive community but are part of their child's racial ethnic community to help them think about things in a little bit different way. And once you, in the context of a relationship, that's a lot easier, both for people of color to give that kind of advice in a way that's tailored to that person, and also for the person who is transracially parenting to take that advice because it's from a person who knows you.
In relevance to, I particularly picked up on your comment, be open to what your child is telling you and don't ask them to prove it. We got a question that I want to read, and it's not directly on point there because the child wasn't asking to prove, but she says, my 11-year-old black son went to the toy section of Walmart to look at toys while I shopped. He was followed by a store clerk, I assume because they thought he was going to shoplift. I don't know whether to address this with him as racism because maybe it was or maybe it's not. He could have been followed because he was alone in the toy section at an age where kids do shoplift. Am I introducing the idea of racism where it may not exist? Or am I avoiding the topic if I don't talk with him? She doesn't give us a lot of facts as to whether her son was aware and brought it to her attention, or whether the store clerk did. So there's some.
Right.
I think we can make assumptions about how it came down. So I'm not sure that believing or not believing. It sounds like it's not an issue. It sounds like her son.
She's
is
just
unaware.
not sure what it is. Yeah. It sounds like she's just not sure about how to read this and the degree to which she involves her son in on it versus not. And I guess I'm always struck by these questions because I also feel underlying that is the fear of, oh my God, what if it is racism? And let's pretend that it was. I mean, let's pretend that he was getting followed in the store because he's a black kid. It will. If it didn't happen this time, it will happen for the rest of his life. This will happen, and so I guess I'd want to, and yet I appreciate you don't want to be the parent that is like, oh my God, it was racism, and then go make a big deal out of everything. That is going to be something that is a daily feature. I was followed last week in a grocery store, and it was so incredibly
Oprah Winfrey
obvious.
was followed.
Yeah, I mean, just so that's the point.
Followed.
That's the point. You can't confer. Class doesn't confer privilege. Making $1 bazillion like Oprah doesn't purchase you out of being black. It just doesn't. And so, it very well might have been racism. And so to me, the big question here isn't whether or not it's racism, but rather how is her son experiencing it, and sitting and talking with him about the meaning that he's making from that, and see, like where he is. But also to think through with him, what would be the harm in having a conversation? Sometimes people get followed in stores. Sometimes this happens. It could happen to you. Let's talk about different ways in which you can handle this, because sometimes it might make you mad. Because I know it made me mad last week when I felt all indignant about, like, how dare this person. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, nobody should get, it's not the fact that I'm a professor or I make X number of dollars or I could buy anything in the store, which is initially where my indignation took me. But it really is the fact that as a brown-skinned woman, I'm walking in a store that I regularly shop, and I get followed around for just shopping. There was nothing I was doing suspicious. So this will happen to her son. And if she noticed it, or if he noticed it and brought it to her, it's big enough to talk about. It's the time. It's the time. And nope, you don't need to make a big deal about it because this is going to happen so often that you cannot make a big deal about it. Sometimes you will. Sometimes you will choose that one of the options is to go to the store and confront them and talk with them and do an intervention for the store. Sometimes that may be what you choose to do. But most of the time, you will not have the time or energy to do that every day. So then it's thinking through, okay, how do you want to handle this when this happens? How do you want to, what are the ways that we want to go through and handle this? What does this mean? And just have a conversation so it's not so emotion-laden about was it racism or not, but rather these things happen. Stores need to protect themselves from having things stolen. This is a feature of how they've organized their protecting their merchandise. They're going to follow people who look suspicious. Sometimes they do this in ways that are racist. Sometimes they do this in ways that are classist. Sometimes you will get read that way. How do you want to deal with it? And it's just matter of fact. It doesn't need to be so emotionally charged. And I think sometimes that's one way in which white people who haven't experienced this a lot of times can get really emotionally ramped up about it and make it a bigger deal, and then resort to the choices. Either you talk about it and make it a big deal, or you don't talk about it at all. And what I'm suggesting is there's something in between where it's just matter of fact. This is just how the world is.
And I also sense, and perhaps I'm projecting here, but that the mom is afraid to introduce racism where it's not, because she doesn't want to make her child aware of racism, or she doesn't want her make her child feel lesser because of his race. And so talk a little about that fear of,
so I
my
think
son feel like he's not as good as anybody else just because he has more melanin in his.
And the best way to do that is to teach him that some people actually do think that, and they are wrong. Rather than pretending that the poison isn't in the water, so drink it anyway. It's to recognize where the poison is, where the water is, and how to distinguish that. By talking about race and talking about racism and the fact that it exists, you're not introducing racism. Racism already has been introduced. It's already there. And so the only inoculation and antidote to it is to talk with them about that it exists, all the places where it's likely to show up, and for in this case her son, but for children to be able to sniff it out and recognize it, and have armor.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. And have an armor.
Go ahead.
And here's the thing: at 11, he is aware of it. Whether or not, I don't know. In this, I don't
promise
know in this case,
he is. Yeah, no, he
exactly.
is. Yeah, I promise.
He may
11?
or may not know whether he was being followed, but he knows racism at 11.
He has been teased already. People have asked him questions. Like, I don't know where he's growing up, but yes, by 11, he is as aware of race as the fact that he is a boy. And that whether or not he likes girls or not, or these sorts of things, like 11, yes. And so you're not, so that the issue isn't that you're going to somehow introduce racism into a pristine environment. The racism is already there. Your son has already been followed in the store. It's there. And so how do you make sure that he isn't left with your parental silence to make meaning of it on his own? Like, as a parent, wouldn't you want your voice to be in his ear as he's dealing with this without you in his community and in his stores? Wouldn't you want you to be the one that's there with him when he's got to deal with this, whether you're physically there or not? But it has already happened, and it is going to happen. And he, at this age, they're watching to see whether or not, as parents, we're able to stand there with them, or whether or not we're so freaked out we can't talk about it, and they can sense that.
And this is where you would go back to your, to use your academic term, reference point. I would say this would be going back to the people who are adults of the race that your child is, and find out. There are a number of, as you said, there is a range of responses to any number of situations, and in this case, being followed in a store. And you could think of one or two, but I guarantee a black man or a black woman has got probably 15.
Bazillions.
Of knowing how, okay, let me run through my list of possible ways I'm going to handle this. How much time do I have? How overt is it? Whatever. How pissed off I am? Whatever.
Yes,
so
all these things are factored in.
Yes, and so go to your reference point and find out from that person, ask that. Hopefully there's more than one. My son was followed in a store. I want to talk with him. What are some of the options you run through in your head when you're followed in a store? When this happens. And so that I can start talking with my son. And would you also talk with my son about so let's get the conversation going, and so that he has options of knowing how to handle it. Exactly. Let me remind everyone that you are listening to Creating a Family, talk about adoption and foster care. Today we're talking about how adult transracial adoptees navigate race when they age with Dr. Gina Samuels. She is an associate professor of the University of Chicago at the School of Social Service Administration, and she's an affiliate at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. And another and here, she is a transracial adoptee. She's an adult, obviously, adult transracial adoptee. This show is brought to you by the support of partners who believe in our mission of providing unbiased education and support. One such partner is Adoptions from the Heart. They have helped build over 6,000 families since 1985 through domestic infant adoption, and they work with people all across the United States. All right, now we're back. Dr. Samuels, what are some things for white parents to be aware of that they may not be aware of because they have not personally experienced it? And I have actually two examples I want you to talk about. One, that there is research, and it's really strong research, that shows that black children are perceived as older than they are. How does that impact a child? You've got this, the example we were working with before, this 11-year-old may well look 13 or 14. Or you've got a 8-year-old little girl who could maybe looks 12 or 13. Maybe that's a stretch, but let's say 11. So how does this impact parenting?
So I think in part, especially with black kids, I think this research has been particularly focused on the ways in which teachers and other white people read young black children as adults, as older than they are. And we see it even in media reports where they'll say, a young man, the age of 17, and it's usually a black face that we see. And so I think what this means in terms of parenting is that even if in your world an 11-year-old is a little kid, which they are a little kid at 11, the world may be seeing them as a teenager. And when you lay on top of that a race, there is a particular way in which then authority figures might be dealing with your child that is completely developmentally advanced, way beyond the way that they should be dealt with. And so this means that not only should you be thinking, oh, what do I do with this 11-year-old, but you should be having these conversations far earlier than you might think or might actually be accurately developmentally appropriate, so that your child is ready not only for their actual developmental stage, but for the way in which society is going to put on them perhaps a more advanced developmental stage than where they even are, than is even fair for them.
And I think, and certainly you were just speaking in kind of in reference to males, and you're right, there's a problem there. But I also think it influences girls because they're perceived as being sexually older, and more mature than their age, which and they may well be developmentally their age from an emotional standpoint, and that throws them into situations that they're just not prepared to handle. Yep.
Yeah. So I think, again, the theme of our conversation is there may be a truth that lies within your family and the reality that it is, but once you step outside, the world gets a vote on the meaning of race and how much it matters, on the age of your child and who they are, and that your parenting has got to take that seriously.
And just throw out another example. I think your advice is spot on for both, and that is the fetishizing, that attraction that some white men have to Asian women and Asian girls. And now I don't think that Asian girls are perceived older than they are.
Right.
But so you may not have to be thinking about this with your 11-year-old. But at some point, when they're reaching teenage years, it's something to be aware of.
Yeah, and so I think this is another kind of not an awareness that I think most white people have about how gender is experienced and sexuality is experienced differently when you're not a white female, and that Asian females have this. There are certain, we talked about earlier with black girls and a kind of this early sexuality. This is also true, the exotification of multiracial girls. Latinas are thought to be spicy sexual. So there's all kinds of ways in which race intersects with gender such that it puts young girls of color in a particular spotlight that for some white parents, in particular white mothers, may be a completely new way to understand femininity, sexuality, development, risk, danger, who will come to their protection, who will not come to their protection, in a completely different way.
And so from a parent's standpoint, what I hear you saying is that pretending it doesn't exist because you wish it didn't exist is not a solution.
Yeah, and I would say it's harmful. So I would go as far as saying not only is it just not a solution, it's that you're harming your child by sending them out in a world that doesn't exist for them. It just doesn't. And so the closest we'll ever come to living in the world that group of parents wants to live in is by preparing your kids to fight against the world that they're going to have to live in, so that they can be safe and feel prideful and learn to recognize early on the warning signs of people who might harm them and might think that they are less, so that they don't internalize those kinds of messages as their own, so they get clear messages that they are not whatever it is society is saying negatively about them. But they need to know that those things do exist, so that when they hear them, they know they're real and they have something that they can resist that from.
And we're talking about, and you have said a number of times that one of the first things we should do is initiate a conversation, that our silence is perceived as ignorance from our child, and we're shutting down. So what are some other, so talking, yes, and I can only guess that surrounding our children with other adults of their race would be immensely helpful, because these are people who have actually had to face it.
And doing it not just for the kid. So, really taking this on as we're just a multiracial family, period. This is how we live. This is what we do. Parents have these friendships. Some of them will have nothing to do with the child, and the child gets to see, my parent has friendships with all kinds of people. And they're not just there for me, because of me. They're there because this is how my parent lives, and this is who my parent is, and this is the social circle that they operate within. Because it can't be just for the kid. That starts to feel a little fake and then constrained. So it really needs to be just, this is how we as a family live. And then these people can be deployed just like any family would, when something is happening. Any parent might pull in one of their friends to talk to their kid, or an auntie or an uncle or whoever. That's just normal. And so then it just becomes a normal deployment of your friendship network and your social network. And I think the other important piece is really to recognize all the different communities that, by virtue of being a transracial adoptee, you now become a member of, accountable to, et cetera. So there's, if you're a white parent or you have a white parent in this mix, then there's the white community. Then there's the communities of color that your kids might be a part of. There's the transracial adoptee community. There's the multiracial community, which is oftentimes a home for many transracial adoptees, both because they are oftentimes multiracial, but also because they come from a multiracial family. And so all of these different communities, and across different ages, adults, kids, can be important resources. Kids need other kids to be able to look to and say, I like what they're doing. This is what I'm dealing with. So sometimes there's a generational difference in that divide. Is for the same reason why a kid might not feel comfortable talking to their parent might be the same reason why a kid doesn't want to talk to their parent's friend. And so they might talk to their parent's friend, but it also is important that kids have a collection of options to be able to go to in a natural, kind of everyday, normal way, and then it doesn't feel fabricated, like all this extra stuff has to happen for them.
And it allows it not to be a big deal. Okay, I need this information.
Normalizes
I'm going to have to. Exactly, it normalizes that you seek help and you've got lots of people to ask.
And you're just going to do it.
Yeah, and it makes it easier as opposed to,
much easier.
Mom's going to have to figure out who to call, and it's going to be embarrassing. And
it's just especially the older they get, that just really doesn't. Yeah.
You talked about all the different communities that transracial families are tangentially or directly a part of. And one of the things I have interviewed adult transracial adoptees, or a young adult, well, I've interviewed all ages, but in particular, we did a panel once with young adults in there. I think the oldest was like 25. And one of the things that they talked about, or one of the young adult talked about, was the, I don't know that he would have said it was an advantage, but he talked about that he felt that he could flow easily between both races. Mm-hmm. Is that something that research has been able to tease out, or was that just his individual experience?
That's actually a very common finding in multiracial research. So, I would say there's a lot of, part of my work is in transracial adoption, but it overlaps with for people who are mixed race. And I think transracial adoptees, though some of them are not themselves mixed race, they are growing up in a mixed race, a multiracial family, and have benefit of exposure to multiple races, multiple cultures. And so I think one of the upsides when things go well is that you do have a lot of cultural capital in a lot of different spaces, which is great. It is sort of the foundation of what many institutions are trying to be in their quest towards diversity and multiculturalism and inclusivity and all of these things that we're trying to find ways to appreciate the plurality of ways in which people live. And for those of us who've grown up in our own families in a plurality and figured out how to do that for the benefit of all members, there's a huge strength, but it requires everybody to show up. It requires everybody to see each other and value each other as different and learn from one another. But that is a very common thing that people who have grown up either as a multiracial person or grown up in a multiracial family will oftentimes list as a benefit or a strength of having grown up multiracial.
And so oftentimes report that they have best friends in more than one race, which I think we're moving to that as a nation, but I'm not sure we're there. In fact, I'm sure we probably aren't there. But so that is a perceived strength as well. And when you said that it's important that people, for this to happen, because indeed this is a plus for transracial adoption, or it can be, I should say. You said people need to show up, and value people is different. I'm assuming that you mean parents need to show up and value and appreciate that their child is different and appreciate the value that brings. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, so let me ask what you meant by that.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And in some ways, I would argue that's the task of parenting in all cases. In all cases, when we have kids, there's all these expectations, hopes about who they're going to be, and then we discover that actually they're different. And they've got their own little agendas and their own little worlds and talents. And some of watching them grow and develop, if you do it well, is actually figuring out a way to reposition yourself as a cheerleader to who they are, not as a confirmation of who you are. And it just becomes another layer when you introduce race onto that. And I think a lot of times in families we run the risk of thinking that closeness is only fostered when we all are the same. We're all the same by race, or we're all the same by genetics, or we're all the same because we have the same color hair, or we're all the same religion, or we're all the same whatever it is. And that actually isn't how most healthy families are fostered, and connections aren't most deep when everybody's the same. That difference can be a profound place of connecting. But I think many of us don't come from a way of knowing that suggests that that's true. And so folks come to transracial adoption thinking, how are we going to be family despite this difference? Or, to try to decenter the difference, or to ignore the difference, or ignore the difference and make everybody the same, or only focus on our sameness. And I think that's a mistake because it closes off the possibility of really being able to fully realize the positive that transracial adoption can be, or the positive that multiracial families can be. And so when I say everybody's got to show up with who they are, yes, it's the parents, but it's also parents making sure that in the family there's space for their kids to fully realize who they are, as they're growing up. And that's kind of yet to be determined, but that there's space for them to be whoever they are. And that a lot of times that doesn't happen until, as we were talking about earlier, kids transition into adulthood. They go off and make their own decisions about who they're going to partner with, where they're going to live, what they're going to name their kids, if they're going to search for a biological family, et cetera. And so all kinds of things happen eventually anyway. But how nice would it be if it could be happening all along?
We have another question. She says, my 7-year-old daughter prefers to play with white baby dolls and white Barbies. I'm making in this, she doesn't say, but I'm making the assumption that her daughter is not white.
Right.
She has both colors of dolls. My husband wants to get rid of the white one, so she'll play with the black one. We have never taught her that one is preferable to another. In fact, just the opposite. We'd appreciate some insight into what she is thinking and how we can help make sure she is proud of being a black little girl.
Yeah, she's 4. I don't know. Some of this I kind of...
No, she's 7. I'm not sure it matters.
Oh, 7? So,
yeah.
Sometimes I get very cavalier about this and just say, just let her play with whatever doll she wants, as long as she's got the options and stuff. I mean, but I don't want to also... I want to affirm that this is really good, that they're paying attention to that and care about that. And I would be doing the same thing. And I would be freaking out about my kid liking the white doll better. And I would be absolutely thinking about maybe just eliminating all the white options so that she could only choose variations of brown. So I appreciate the husband. I appreciate where he's at. But I also might think, that's one venue where she's working out things that she likes and doesn't like. And I do think it matters to pay attention to what she's attracted to and rather than to be reactive by taking all the white dolls, like she's still going to have access to whiteness, to seeing that. I would just do it, I'd be wanting to sit back with my partner and say, okay, let's survey what she's getting exposed to and why maybe this is happening. And try to figure out other things that we can do to counterweight some of this attraction over time. Like just playing with white dolls while she's 7 does not necessarily represent an identity problem. It's a piece of information that would trigger my attention as well. So I appreciate that concern. But I also wouldn't want to make it so much of a big deal that then you're shaming her for liking a certain race of a doll. And so, she should, would we have the same reaction if she was choosing Korean dolls or Latina dolls instead of black dolls? So to try to slow down our initial reaction a little bit and think through, okay, this is a piece of information. We wish she liked the brown ones. But it's not the only piece of information, and to try to think through, where is this coming from, and have conversations with her, and not to get, again, back to that, oh my gosh, is my kid being followed at 11? I think sometimes white parents get a bit overreactionary one way or another when things could just be talked about and questioned. Did you ask her why she likes the white dolls better?
That's kind of what I'd want to know is why,
what's she thinking? I don't know why she's liking that. I mean, we could put on a race lens and the academic could be like, oh, it's because the social construction of whiteness is superior and blah, blah. And maybe that's part of it. It's very possible that's part of it. But it could
or
also,
maybe
there could
she
just
likes the clothes that the white Barbie came with. Or,
Maybe. Yeah, it could be really that simple. So just before we just freak out about it, invite her into that conversation and start having conversations with her about that and about, aren't these other dolls pretty also? Don't you also really love their hair? I really love their hair. I remember listening to my mom, and she would always on TV, different races of people would come on, and she would gush about how beautiful they are and how lovely they are. And they could be any race of whatever and any gender. And so I just think before we put our lens on it, to invite the kid into the conversation in an innocuous way so you can learn more about what's going on before you react to it.
And you say, okay, we don't jump to the conclusion with a 7-year-old that her preference for a white Barbie or a white baby doll is an indication of a confused or unhealthy racial identity. But so tell us what should we as parents look for and be concerned with our children for and throw out some ages so we know what we're talking about here for an unhealthy or a confused racial identity.
I think that's a hard question to ask because I think it could look different and present itself differently at different times. And I also am a strong believer that people have a right to decide their own identity. And so even what we would call unhealthy may not be for some kids in some circumstances living in some contexts. And so, is it really that unhealthy for a kid who's not racially mixed to come to an identity that is racially mixed because he's trying to find a way of being inclusive of his adoptive and biological origins? I don't know. I'm open to that, And so I think to me what I more so look for is less about the labels they're using or anything like that, and more about what's underneath it. Is this child feeling ashamed of their hair or their skin? Are they trying to, change it in some kind of way that signals to you that they don't like who they are, that they don't like how they look, that they want to change some kind of aspect of themselves and haven't learned to appreciate and love that? That to me is far more concerning than these other things, which I think we think are cues to these other things. But I would rather look for these other things than the labels they're using or the dolls they're playing with. I'd be much more worried as a parent about my child not feeling confident in who they are and how they look and loving themselves and feeling a sense of belonging on their own terms.
Mhm. Very well said that we need to not look at the superficial with our children, because none of us. I mean, I have a friend of mine whose son was gay when he went off to college. She made sure she drove by the LGBT community center, and she wanted him to know where it was, and she made sure that she pointed it out to him. And he said, "Mom, I don't want to just. That's not what I'm. That's not how I want.
Not my whole
to be."
community. Yeah.
Yeah, he said, I want to, I want to play intramurals. I want to do, and she was frustrated.
She was trying.
And
that was great.
I know,
Yay, Mom.
she said, darn, I looked it up and put it on GPS to make sure we'd accidentally drive by, and then he's telling me that I'm pushing him.
Right.
So sometimes we parents, we can't win for losing, but
yeah, I know. That's the truth. I guess that's a good way to kind of wrap up. Is that you're going to make mistakes. Like you're going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. And so to me, the best you can do is develop a kind of relationship with your kid where you have been talking about these things all along and that your kid knows you can handle it, that you're not going to melt and freak out. You're not going to reject them. You're not going to ask them to prove that their perception of something isn't wrong, that you are on their side with this, and that and then that is the core of, I guess, all good parenting, but it especially comes into play here where you're dealing with some pretty insidious social issues that will come into your family.
Yes. And to be there, you are going to be their cheerleader regardless, and that's we want our. Thank you so much, Dr. Gina Samuels, for talking with us today about this topic, which is such an important one for. I think it's important for all of us, but it's certainly important for those of us who have chosen to become a transracial family through adoption. Let me remind everybody that the views expressed in this show are those of the guest and do not reflect necessarily the position of Creating a Family, our sponsors, or our underwriters. And also know that this is general advice, and to understand how it applies to your specific situation, work with your adoption professionals. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to us today, and I will see you next week.
Right now at the Home Depot, you'll save up to 35% off appliance special buys, like a GE Appliances top-load washer and dryer pair, with deep clean and deep rinse options, a reliable heavy-duty agitator, and 4 precise water levels, just $478 each. Wash, dry, save, repeat. Today is the day for doing. With Spring Black Friday savings now at the Home Depot. More saving, more doing. U.S. only while supplies last. Gas, dryer, extra. See store for details. Valid through April 17th.